Hi, my name is Tom Mueller, and my girlfriend Kate and I did a wonderful bike trip along the Danube River in Austria starting on July 3rd of this year. Our trip started in Passau, Germany, which is right on the Austrian border, then headed downstream along the Danube over 6 days until we reached Vienna, or Wien as it's pronounced in German. We took a self-guided tour, and that means that the tour company provided all the hotel bookings. They arranged for each of the hotels, and that included breakfast every morning. They moved our luggage every day. We had to have it in the lobby by 9, and that would be in our hotel when we arrived at the next night hotel. They provided a bicycle rental. It would have been too expensive to bring our own bikes. We rented bikes there. They also suggested a route. There were paths on both sides of the Danube, and at any one point, one side might be better than the other. It might be more scenic or less traffic. So we followed their suggestions on which side to ride at what point and when to cross. They also suggested attractions we might want to stop and see along the way. We were on our own then for lunch and for dinner every day. We're in Chicago, so we flew from Chicago to London, and that got there early morning, and then we took a morning flight to Munich. Then early that afternoon, we took the train from Munich to Passau, arriving about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Our hotel was right across the street from the train station, so it was easy to find. And we had a very comfortable room, a typical European room with feather beds and fairly Spartan by American standards, but very comfortable nonetheless. And it was still mid-afternoon, so we decided to walk around the town. This is Passau, a very pretty town. It's at the intersection of two rivers, the Danube and the Inns River. Very scenic, very old, lots of neat old winding streets, and also hilly, as you might expect in a river city. Interesting buildings, winding passageways. Lots of interesting doors. I love pictures of doors anyway. So there's lots of interesting ones there. There was a castle across the river, across the Danube. Parts of it were very old, parts of it were modern. Lots of old buildings that appear to be medieval. This was on the Inns River side. A few weeks before we arrived, the Danube had flooded. In fact, it was the worst flooding in about 500 years. You can see the level of the river there on that tower. Amazingly, they had cleaned up very well. There wasn't a lot of visible damage from the flood. That's me under the bridge in that tower. Looking across the Inns River to the other side. As we walked around, we saw this passageway and decided to look, and there was a courtyard for a church. When we went in, the church was incredibly ornate, and we read more about it and found out that it has the world's largest pipe organ. Some incredible frescoes. Finally ready for dinner, and we went to a beer garden in Passau. This was it. Here's Kate with a Weissbier. And I had sauerbraten and potato dumplings and red cabbage. And this was the first day of the ride. We got up to start the ride. In this day, we crossed the bridge at Passau and rode on the south side of the river down to a little town called Engelhartsel. There we took a ferry across the river and then rode on the north side down to the S-curve. There's a famous S-curve in the Danube, and the tour company recommended that we take a ferry to go through the S-curves, and we did that and got out there and then rode on the south side again down to Aschach, crossed the river to the bridge, and went back up a little ways to Feldkirchen, where our hotel was. These were the bikes we rented. They were surprisingly very good. Kettler bikes made in Germany. The company gave us panniers for each of the bikes to carry stuff in during the ride, but we're very pleased with the bikes. And here we're ready to start. We're going to start by crossing that bridge behind us. The day was a little bit threatening, a little overcast, especially at the start, but it was a nice ride most of the day, a little bit of rain. Here Kate's coming across a bridge across a small stream. And this very shortly we came to the border with Austria and entered into Austria. There's no customs or anything like that, and it was like going across state lines in the U.S. This is what the path looked like for most of the trip. Nice paved path, very smooth, very little traffic. Every so often along the path there would be signs that told you a little bit about the town or the place you were, gave you some highlights. Unfortunately, there wasn't much in English, and our German wasn't great, but we could generally make out what was going on. Beautiful little towns along the way. This is Engelhartsel, the first stop we made. They had a painting at the edge of town that kind of gave a little bit about their history. Just a pretty little European town. We decided to stop and get some coffee and something to eat. So I had coffee and some apple strudel. Then it was time to take the ferry across. When we went down the ramp, we could see the ferry on the other side. They saw us and then came across. Once there, they tied up and let down the ramp in the front of the boat so we could wheel our bikes on. This is what it looked like once we got on. And then they took the ferry back across. It's very easy, cost a couple of euros, and then we rode on the north side of the trail. There's a lot of interesting buildings. This one looked pretty old, but it was a private residence along the way. And we got on to where we were going to catch the next ferry through the S-curve a little early. It was about 45 minutes before it was going to be able to go, so we decided to have lunch. And there's just a little farmhouse that had a few tables and served food. This was the menu. Kate saw a sign for Most, which is a pear-based drink, so we decided to try some of that. And this is it. It wasn't anything that was all that great, but it was interesting and kind of fun to try. Got some food. Kate got a cheese sandwich, or Käsebrot, and I got a meat sandwich, Fleischbrot, that had horseradish grated on top of it. It actually was very good. And we got on to the Santa Maria. This is the ferry that would take us through the S-curves. There's our bikes stacked along the side. Several other people got on. And the ride itself was about half an hour. We saw some houses along the side of the river and some ruins of castles, the first castle ruins we saw along the way. First of many. The barge traffic on the river and a little chapel next to the bike path on the side of the river. There's a lot of these we would see as through our trip. And here we are on the ride. Got somebody to take our picture together. And this is where we would get off, at this little village here. There's a restaurant there, but we'd already eaten. And then we rode the rest of the way down to Aschach, and some castles along the way. Here's another picture of that one. This one apparently is still in use, with some older sections down by the river. And this is, as we got into Aschach, this is our hotel. We could see across the river. We had to go another mile or so down and cross the bridge to come back to it. It was a very pretty place. It had a very steep driveway. We ended up walking our bikes up the hill. This is what the hotel looked like when we got there. They had a very lovely patio that looked over the river, so we decided to have dinner there. On the second day of the ride, we went to Enns. So there we continued on the north side of the river to Ottensheim and stopped and had a little bit of coffee and food. Then rode to Linz and crossed the river and had lunch. Then we crossed back, rode on the north side of the river down to a power plant where we crossed the river and then rode the rest of the way into Enns. So this is the path, the beginning of the second day, and we rode to Ottensheim and stopped at this little bakery that had coffee and stuff. It's a really pretty little town, and it had interesting texture, several tables with umbrellas. It was a little bit rainy that day. As we were having our coffee, there was a funeral procession came out of the church across the street. Just again, a very pretty little town. As we rode on, we saw more buildings along the river. It's an old castle that apparently still in use. And we got toward Linz. The day was much brighter, very pretty. And we stopped a little shop and had some sausages for lunch. And then after lunch we had to have some Linzer Torte. The city is famous for their torte. We didn't think it was all that great, but it was a nice little dessert. When we got to Enns, this was the hotel we stayed in. Enns, it was a very old building. You could see that it had been completely rehabbed. But it was very nice and very modern, but still very charming because it was so old. This was the tower in the center of the square in Enns. Built somewhere in the 1200s, apparently initially used for defense, but now it had a souvenir shop and stuff. It was center of the city square, and around it were several restaurants and some parking, a lot of open-air restaurants there. There was also a palace in town that now could be rented out, and we were there, and apparently there was a wedding going on. And a charming little fence we saw along the way. And we had dinner at the hotel that night. Kate had Wiener Schnitzel, and I had Cordon Bleu, both very good. The next day we were riding to Maria Tafel. We got up a little early. The route that day would go back to the river from Enns. We'd ride to the river, take a ferry across, and go to Mauthausen. That day the weather was fairly threatening, and the forecast was it was going to rain all day, and so I wasn't really excited about riding 40 miles in the rain. So we decided to take a ferry. There was boats along the river that would go every day, and we could catch one in Mauthausen and take it to Ybbs, which was most of the way down the river. So we did that. We got off and rode to the town, and then the hotel came and took us to Maria Tafel. The last 3 kilometers are very steep climb, and so they would haul you and your bike up there. This, by the way, was our breakfast. Pretty typical German and Austrian breakfast. Lots of bread and cold cuts, some sliced vegetables, typically yogurt, and muesli, and that was pretty much it. You didn't really see eggs or bacon or any of the typical American things, but it was a very good breakfast. This was our breakfast that day. And they had a farmer's market set up in the square, so we walked around that before we took off. Then we rode down to there and took the ferry across. And here's Kate on the ferry. And the ferry boat itself. And we're going across to Mauthausen. A very interesting little town, very steep. We walked our bike up the hills. There was an interesting looking church we wanted to see. So we walked up to that. And the church itself wasn't all that interesting, but there was this little building along to the side, and it was open. We went in and took a look. It looked like it was set up for funerals, but there were some very old paintings along the wall. And the sign basically says those frescoes were done in Roman times, about 1250, so the building itself must be older than that. This again is the church. And looking from the churchyard out over the town and the river, a very nice view. And as I mentioned, it was pretty threatening, so we decided to take a boat. We went down to dock and waited for the boat to come in, and we caught the Anton Bruckner. And this is us waiting to roll on board. We just brought our bikes on board and stacked them in the bottom deck, and then went up to the top deck and watched the scenery go by. We had some refreshments. Kate had a peach spritzer, and I had a drink Marzen. I'm not sure exactly what that was. It was pretty similar to beer, but it was pretty good. And we had another passenger take our picture along the way. We went about 25-30 miles on the river, and in that distance we passed through 2 dams. There's a lot of power dams along the Danube, and to get by those we had to use the lock. So at this point we're floating into the lock, and once the boat was there entirely, they would raise a wall in the back to keep water from the river from flowing in there, and then they would start draining the itself, and you can see here it's dropped about 6 or 8 feet. Altogether it dropped about 20 feet, and you can see a kind of swirling area here where the water is draining out. Once it drained down to the level of the lower part of the river, they would open the doors and then we could sail out. Lots of interesting buildings along the way. This was one. I don't really know what it is. It was, even though it was cloudy, it's very pretty. We had some very, very nice scenery. Another interesting building. And this is the town of Grün or something. It was one that Kate hated to miss, so I had to promise her we'd go back. Along the way, this group of kids got on. They were all in traditional costume, lederhosen and drindels. I don't know if they'd been performing somewhere or this is just what they wore, but they got up in the top deck and had a lot of fun as we went along. Another interesting building we saw. Here's some bike riders along the way on the trail. Here you can see the remnants of a castle up here. And here we're getting into another lock situation very close to Ybbs. So this is Ybbs. This is where we got out. And one of the first things we saw was markings on this building that showed the height that the river floods had been over time. The tallest one here was from 1501, and actually the flooding this year came a little bit above that. But you can see several other marks along the way. In Ybbs we found a neat little restaurant, kind of away from the city center, and stopped and had lunch. I had some liver dumpling soup, and then ordered something. I wasn't quite sure what it was. It turned out to be a couple of hot dogs and some beef goulash. And it had something much more interesting. After lunch, we got back on the trail. This is kind of a decoration for the bike path, and this building was very interesting. It turned out it was a psychiatric hospital. And the scenery started to get a lot more interesting. This one was a little bit away from the river. We're going through some fields. You can see the river a little bit there. And some pretty towns along there. We got to Marschach, and this town had been hit pretty hard by the flooding. We stopped and had some ice cream, and then it started to rain, so we camped out in this little overhang in this building, and there was a guy inside there, and the building itself was kind of gutted. And we started talking to him, and it turned out he was the owner of this hotel. And he said the water had been 8.5 feet deep within that first story, and they had tried storing everything on the second floor, and it just got up enough that it got everything wet and ruined everything inside the building, so he had to completely gut it and start over again. So he was in the process of building it back so he could open up as a hotel. From there, he called the hotel, and they came down and loaded our bikes onto a trailer and took us up to the hotel. This was the hotel we stayed in, the Hotel Rose. Pretty typical European bed. Again, the mattresses and feather beds. But it had this incredible view outside. I tried to animate this. So you can see this is a kind of a panorama from our balcony. And what the view is, it'll come by once more. Just an incredible view out that our patio door. And after the rain had stopped, we had a rainbow. And then it cleared up a little bit, so we were able to walk around. This was the church that the town is named after, Maria Tarfel. This was the church that the Archduke of Ferdinand attended. He was the one whose murder sparked the First World War. Very pretty, ornate church inside. It was incredible how much detail and stuff into the churches that we saw there. Another big pipe organ. Our hotel had a big chess set out on a patio that people could play. And here again you can see how things look out over the valley. We found a hotel there in town that had a restaurant with a patio that overlooked the valley. Just a really beautiful setting. Here's Kate, but you can see what the view looked like behind her. I had some boiled beef, and that was like a cornmeal cake with vegetables, and Kate had a risotto dish. It was both very good. The next day was our longest day. We rode from Riatarfel to Krems. That day we started, first we rode back down to the river from the Hotel Rose. It was a very fun ride because it was all downhill. And then rode along the river to Pochlarn, and there we crossed and rode to Melk and had lunch in Melk, and there we crossed back and then rode on the north side of the river all the way to Krems. So this was the downhill part from Riatarfel. The cemeteries were very ornate. This one in particular was very colorful, had a lot of interesting headstones we could see as we went by. And made our way back down to the river and started along. After a while we stopped just to have a drink of water and had this little rest area here. But we missed a castle not too far away, just above where we were. So we decided to see if we could explore it. On our way up there, this was as we got close. And we managed to find our way back and find a path that went up there. It turned out it must be privately owned because most of it was locked up, but it was open that day, having some kind of function there, and they were setting up tables for a dinner. So here are the tables you can see down below. People were setting up a buffet line. It was probably going to be that evening, and we were still in late morning at that point. But very, very interesting little structure. There wasn't a whole lot left of it, but it was very fun to walk around and see. Then we rode into Melk, and this is the Abbey at Melk. It's a pretty famous structure. It's having some work done. But we stopped first to get some lunch, a neat little restaurant along the way, and then went up and toured the Abbey. And it was an incredible structure, very pretty, very... There was a tour going on, but it was all in German, and we tried for a while to keep up with it, but we really couldn't understand enough to see what was going on, so we kind of went off on our own and just explored a little bit. But lots of interesting rooms and buildings. This was the chapel itself. Again, another very ornate church. Lots of statues and gold leaf. They had a very interesting wooden clock. It was made entirely of wood, but ran. It had been there for a couple 100 years. After we got done with the Abbey, we headed across the river and the bridge to go to the north side of the river, and it was a pretty long ride that afternoon, but we stopped along the way at a little place called Susie's and got some refreshments. So they had some very good ice cream bars there that we had a bite of. And it was starting to get really pretty along here. It was getting much hillier and starting into a bunch of orchards and vineyards along the way. There was a very interesting castle across the river that we would catch glimpses of every so often as we went. And I went through several little towns that were really interesting. This was one just with this tiny little church. You can see Kate riding in front of it. And some interesting structures, a train trestle there, and vineyards in the background. And another little chapel along the bike trail. It's really very interesting. This is another shot of that same castle. As we got closer, we could see a little bit more. It really is an ideal place to put a castle. It's very defendable. I could see back then, and there were several structures on it. We went through one little town, and the fire department was having some sort of event, apparently a fundraiser, but they were selling beer and some food, so we decided to stop and get some refreshment. There's Kate with a glass of wine. I think I had a Radler, which is a combination of beer and lemon lime soda, which actually was pretty good. Some of the locals there visiting. As we continued on the ride, I went through several little towns, had lots of interesting buildings and churches along the way. This one in particular was very interesting. Church itself was not open, but we could walk around. The graveyard, the cemetery was right next to the church, and again, some very ornate stones. But we saw these buildings in the background and went to look, and the round one in particular was open. And we go inside, And it was several different stories. There was stairs going between the stories and this big mural in the background. It looks like it was built for defense, at least at one point. There were these keyhole windows and some slotted windows that were wider on the inside for shooting arrows out of. And then up on top was an open area you could look. And it was some very nice views looking back down along the path and along the river. And we could also look and see some of the town, and this is the path going out of the town as we continued north. There's lots more really interesting little towns as we went through. One was St. Michael, and this was the church that was the centerpiece of that town. It was built a long time ago, just a hotel here next to the church, but the church itself was built within town walls, these medieval town walls. Just very interesting, a lot of old structures there. Another castle we passed along the way, and just some beautiful scenery along the route. And this was a tower that apparently Richard the Lionhearted was imprisoned in for a period in Austria. And we finally reached Krems. This is a map of the city that was there. I forgot the picture of the hotel, but this is our room. It was much more modern, even though the beds themselves were pretty much the same, with a father bed and so forth. We got there relatively early, and after we checked into our hotel room, we wandered around town a little bit and found a pastry shop and had to walk through. This was some of what we saw. Of course, Kate was really interested in the cake. There was quite a bit of interesting architecture in the town. It was a little frustrating because it was a Sunday afternoon and so much was closed. We looked around for a place to eat and finally found one place that was open. I got an interesting dish that had some fried chicken, some hot dogs, and potatoes. I'm not sure what else was in it. Kate had a much more interesting dish with some, looks like pork and sauerkraut and potatoes. We did find a sporting goods store that had biking gear that looked like traditional Austrian dress, looked like lederhosen and drindels. On the fifth day of the ride, we went from Krems to Tulln, about 63 kilometers. We crossed the bridge at Krems, went to Tracemauer and had lunch, and then continued on to Tulln. The route was very interesting that day. A lot of vineyards that we're riding through. You can see in the left center here a big abbey. We weren't quite sure what it was, but it was very large. There's Kate at the edge of a vineyard. Very pretty scenery. Lots of vineyards. Went through several small towns. Were all very interesting. And stopped at another church. Here I am outside the gates to the church. One thing we discovered, it was hard to find water a lot of times, but you could always find it in the cemeteries next to the church. They always had water available so people could water the flowers. So we often filled up our water bottles at churches. This is in Tracemauer. There's an old section of the city, had some very interesting buildings. We stopped at a place and had some lunch. Kate was catching up on her journal. And as we rode on to Tulln, we stopped to relax a little bit along the river. I managed to snap a picture of us. Before we got to Tulln, we stopped for a break in the afternoon at this little cafe and had some cake. Just before we got into Tulln, we came across, out in the middle of nowhere, this little shack that was selling juice. Kate noticed that they had elderberry flower juice, and so we stopped some of that. That's what this sign was for, Hollander Blütensaft. Soft is juice, flowers, and Hollander is elderberries. Rich in vitamin C, it says. We got to Tulln and checked into our hotel, and then went and had dinner at a little open-air cafe, the Adlerbrau. This was very typical of all the places we saw in Austria. Had a very good dinner. They had a cream of garlic soup, which was delicious. And then we had a plate of sausage with sauerkraut and fresh grated horseradish. It was very good. This was the hotel we stayed at, the Hotel Rommerhof. The sixth day of the ride, our last, was shorter. It was only 43 kilometers. We rode from Tulln to Vienna. We started out in Tulln, rode to Klosterneuburg, where we stopped for lunch, and then down to a bridge, across the river, over to Vienna, and rode through Vienna, and then finally crossed back again to where our hotel was. Before we rode to Vienna, we stopped at the Botanic Garden in Tulln. They had a very large, well-known botanic garden. We didn't go inside because the entrance fee was pretty high, but we did ride around. There are several trails that rode through the grounds. There's a small church on the way. Some more signage that gives you a little bit about the area. And a place we stopped for some refreshments along the way. They had some food and drink and some amusement park kind of things for the kids. A little church along. We stopped in Klosterneuburg for lunch. I had a sausage and fries. Kate mistakenly ordered that same hot dog and goulash stuff that I'd had a couple days earlier. This is the church that was there in Klosterneuburg. And here's where we're approaching Vienna. We stopped and asked somebody to take a picture. You can see Vienna in the background. And the hotel in Vienna, again, very typical European hotel, but very comfortable. After we got checked in, we walked a couple blocks away at a little guest house and had dinner. Started with some very good tomato soup that had bacon in it. After dinner, we were just a few blocks away from a very famous amusement park in Vienna, the Prater amusement park, I think it was, and they had a very old Ferris wheel with big cars in it. We decided to take a ride. These are what the cars look like. They held several people. And these were the people in the car that we rode. There's about 8 of us in there. Some of the cars were set up for dining tables, and you actually could rent those and have your dinner while you're riding around the Ferris wheel. We didn't see anybody doing that, but there were cars set up that way. Had very nice views. Once you got up a little ways, you can see some of the rest of the amusement park there. So they had a few roller coasters. And this was looking out over Vienna. We think that structure in the middle was part of some anti-aircraft defense structures built by the Nazis back in the Second World War. And afterwards we had some cake. Here Kate is having some. And the next day we explored Vienna quite a bit. This is St. Stephen's Church, very famous, very ornate church. Just some incredible architecture there. Here's a street performer, appeared to be sitting in air. And we went to a little cafe Kate had been to before with a friend of hers. Had sat there and had some coffee and cake, as you might expect. A couple different kinds, in fact. And then just some of the architecture around. Statue of Mozart. And then we visited a market. There's a phenomenal little open-air market there. All kinds of groceries, spices, everything you could think of. Prepared foods. Looks like some wonderful things. Sausages, fish. We stopped and had lunch there, and then took the train back to Munich. So it was a wonderful vacation. If you want to do something like this, the company we used was Bike Tours Direct, and you can find them on www.biketoursdirect.com.